Hey, Ari, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Excited for the conversation.
So, why don't we start by telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at Transcend?
Sure. Transcend is generative design for critical infrastructure. And what that means is we have a software as a service platform where utilities, engineering firms, and technology suppliers can spend 10 or 15 minutes entering information about a potential infrastructure project, and it'll generate a preliminary design for them to evaluate options in the capital planning process. Little on my background, have about 30 years experience in software and about 20 years in water, energy, and infrastructure. I originally entered water, energy, and infrastructure as an investor. And after a few years doing that, spent some time running a wastewater engineering business based in Europe that sold a sustainable technology for treating and recycling wastewater. And that's actually where the software that is the Transcend Design Generator was originally developed. We spun out from them about 5 years ago and have been building the business ever since.
Amazing. And we know as an audience who are predominantly based within the world of construction and engineering that there are some quite prominent challenges that face us, whether it's water scarcity, whether it's the impact of climate change on our infrastructure that we rely so heavily on. I'm really interested to understand your driver. What sort of planetary challenges are the ones that keep you up late at night?
I always think about it from a macro perspective when it comes to critical infrastructure. And if you look at where the world is today, whether it's our transportation infrastructure like highways and bridges or our water infrastructure, which I know you talk about a lot on this podcast, or power infrastructure, data centers, or any kind of critical infrastructure, we have been planning it the same way for 100 years, right? We have a very kind of manual, methodical process to do that. And we are where we are today. When we look at the grades for our infrastructure in the United States, in the UK, and in many places around the world, we're failing. We are not able to keep up with climate change. We're not able to keep up with, for example, snow in Texas, or the pace of water scarcity accelerating across the world. We're not able to keep up with population growth changes and migration that's happening in part because of climate change. Places become uninhabitable and people have to move to another place. We just can't keep up with that pace of change. That's the biggest driver, I think, for moving towards automation in design and generative design like Transcend.
And you've got a really interesting journey, as you mentioned at the start, moving from an investor role through to actually almost trying to get stuck in and help be part of the solution. What was the driver behind that change? Tackling some of the challenges that you're currently getting to grips with are not the easiest. It doesn't attract everyone to the sector. What led to your journey from an investor type role into actually trying to get to grips with building a solution for this?
Yeah. So I had actually started my career in startups in the software world. I came from ERP software and supply chain planning software early on. And then I worked in CRM software. I did a lot of early Salesforce.com implementations when that company was first starting. I went to business school to get my MBA. And after business school, I ended up working at a bank because I had a lot of loans from business school that I had to pay back. And I worked as an oil and gas analyst. So I was covering a lot of the natural gas exploration and production companies when they first started fracking for natural gas, which is actually a very water intensive process. I covered oil refiners, I covered dry bulk shipping, pretty much anybody who's polluting the planet was my coverage universe. And right around the time I had paid back my loans from business school, my daughters were born. I have twin daughters who are turning 17 in a couple of months. I had seen all of this environmental damage done by traditional oil and gas companies and all these other companies that I covered. I started to really think about the future, and You have these little babies. This was right around the time that cleantech was just starting to emerge as an industry, as a sector. I made a decision that I had paid off my financial debt, but I had some planetary debt that I could probably never pay back given how much hundreds of billions of dollars that we had raised for those companies. I was going to spend the rest of my career, my life, trying to pay back that planetary debt to make the world more inhabitable for my children and for their children. That's why I shifted from the oil and gas and investing side over to clean tech, and eventually from clean tech as an investor, I had to get back into running a business, and that brought me to where we are today.
Really quite an admirable route moving into the clean tech world. And it's one that is obviously booming over the years. Water, however, is still very much in its sort of early part of the journey. I know that there's often talk now of water being the new carbon, and there is an increasing amount of venture capital funding flowing into the water sector, which is absolutely brilliant, and obviously a sector very close to both of our hearts. In a world of so many different types of challenges, what made you pick water? What made you pick the world of wastewater to get to grips with to start off?
Yeah, I really first started to get interested in water when I was an oil and gas analyst, and it was through fracking. You would go to these frack sites, and in the very beginning, they were experimenting, right? And they were drilling horizontally to get this gas out of the ground. They didn't know what it was going to take to get the kind of production rates they needed. So they put a lot of water in, and then it would flow out, and they didn't know what to do with it. It was highly contaminated with chemicals and heavy metals, and they would just dig a hole and lay a tarp down in a hole, and they put the water in. Eventually, they figured out that it was dangerous, and they had to store it, and they had to treat it. That was really what started my interest in water. When I jumped into clean tech, I went to work for a fund that was focused on water technology. And this was back in 2004, 2000. It was pretty early days for investing in water. I think more than anything, you fall in love with the people in the industry. I got to know a lot of people in and around the sector, and people are always really passionate about this topic. There's something you touch every day, something everybody can relate to. There is no substitute for it.
No, absolutely. It is such an integral part of our day-to-day lives, but also a resource that is so undervalued, and a sector that could really do with a little bit more love. So it's really great to actually have the attention of innovators trying to tackle some of these challenges. One of the interesting elements of your approach at Transcend is in focusing on design. And there's so much funding flowing into construction tech now. But actually, if you look at the types of challenges that founders are solving within that world, a lot of them are during the construction phase, they're during the delivery phase, and far less investment and innovation occurs within the design phase. So you're almost going against the flow. I'm really interested to understand your thinking behind that, and what
Yeah.
led you to really pick the design phase to build Transcend around.
Yeah. Well, so I would say there's two elements to it. Like, one is kind of business commercial driver, and the other one is really mission driven. And ultimately at Transcend, we're automating preliminary design because we want to help address climate change and enable the construction of more sustainable, resilient infrastructure that can address these problems. I started off by saying this is something that hasn't changed in 100 years. And when we plan a capital project, the way we plan it is very manual, very labor intensive. And we're at the very beginning, right? We're in this world where there's so many options. And you interview startups on this podcast all the time. Many of them are innovating with technologies to make water cleaner or lower the energy consumption, right? To do it more sustainably. If it's so labor intensive and manual in the beginning of a planning process, will anyone ever consider those technologies in that process, or will they just lean towards what they already know, what they've done for decades? When we want to evaluate scenarios, right, like snowfall in Texas or increasing extreme weather events, population growth scenarios, We can't evaluate all those options in the beginning of a project if it's very manual and it's very labor intensive. So the way that we can address that is so if we want to be able to evaluate all those options, we have to change how we do the design work, right? We have to be able to
Mm.
evaluate more options quickly at the beginning of a planning process. We have to attack the problem at the start, which today is the place where we spend the least amount of time and the least amount of money. And we take all these options, all these scenarios, and we narrow them down to a very small number. And then we set a budget. Oh, what a surprise that we overran that budget, or we built infrastructure that we have to then go upgrade 2 years later, or we have a change
Yeah.
order.
Yeah.
This is fundamentally, I think, one of the biggest reasons that we're not moving faster to build the kind of infrastructure we need to address climate change.
Yeah. And do you think that the current approach needs to be reversed in the sense of actually right at the start is when you invest as heavily as possible into trying to identify the most optimal design? Because the amount of rework that we see in the sector is phenomenal. And it's because that early stage design process is so assumption and hypothesis driven. And the priority is trying to get through to a point of single solution as quickly and as efficiently as possible, whilst not quite recognizing the need to avoid rework down the line when you then
Yeah,
discover new parameters or new factors that could affect the worthiness of that single solution.
yeah. Couldn't agree more. The challenge is a financial one, right? At the beginning of a project, we're trying to get a budget approved. And people tend to want to spend less money pre budget approval. And at that stage, it's harder to spend the time that we need to do exactly what you just described. So, if we can use technology to automate that part of the process so that we can quickly and efficiently evaluate more options, more scenarios, more technologies, then we can attack the problem the way that we should be. And that's why we started Transcend 5 years ago. And this platform was built 10 years ago when I ran a sustainable water treatment company. It was so labor intensive to get this technology out there. It was proven. We had operating references, but it was incredibly manual and time consuming. So we could only bid on a few projects a year. And that's how this product came to be. And so the idea was let's bring that to the entire infrastructure design world. And then from the business side, you go where people aren't, right? So if everybody's investing in IoT or in asset optimization, then it's better to be on the design side where there's less people and less competition. So,
And going to where the most opportunity is. You're going to the start of the value chain. So
yeah.
actually introducing your technology right at the start of the value chain, then almost embeds it for the rest of the project lifecycle. Do you think that there's a challenge around the definition of value during the early stages and not quite recognizing the opportunity cost in actually thoroughly evaluating a full set of options and just trying to quickly pick an option as soon as possible?
Yeah. It's interesting when you talk to engineers who are working on a project and you ask them, what options would you evaluate if there were no limits and no resource constraints? That's where their light starts to shine, right? That's where their expertise and their know-how and their decades of experience comes into play. They always have ideas based on past experiences, but they're limited in what they can evaluate because of this being a manual labor intensive process and because of the budget limitations at that stage. So when you talk to them about this, they love that idea, that concept that they could very quickly evaluate those options. I do think that it's a huge change for businesses to take something that today takes 8, 9, 10 months and do it in a few hours. It's a complete change in the business process for a lot of companies. But certainly the opportunity to evaluate these options is something that is really exciting for most of the people we talk to.
It's also reflective of a very natural evolution to our sector in the sense that really this is a capitalization on the advancements in computing power. We now have such powerful computing technology at our fingertips that allows our engineers to evaluate thousands of options at the touch of a button. And one of the interesting elements around wastewater design is the need for a true multidisciplinary approach and the combination of so many different types of data sets from so many different data sources. That is a perfect use case for computing power. That is a perfect opportunity to actually put some of this new technology into the hands of an expert to then make them 10x more powerful and
Yes.
effective in their job, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you think about the future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, people always worry that technologies like Transcend or artificial intelligence technologies will take jobs away, right? We hear about that all the time. The reality is, when you look at technology advancements over the past 100 years, it didn't impact careers and the job growth, especially in a sector like engineering, where this technical expertise is so critical, the way that people expected. But on the other hand, I do think you'll see engineers that use AI and engineers that don't, and a big difference between those because the level of productivity and the kind of superpowers that it gives you as an engineer to be able to evaluate all those options is a true game changer.
No, absolutely. And it's an interesting point that I did want to touch on around almost the sort of the ethical considerations of your technology. And I think one of the really interesting nuances to this that I heard from one of your recent podcast conversations is the important difference between generative AI, which this is not,
Right.
versus generative design, which this is.
Yeah.
And that difference being generative design is deterministic versus the approach of generative AI being much more unpredictable. I think it's a really interesting point and one that maybe not a lot of people will be aware of. Would you mind just expanding on that?
Yeah, sure. So, would you drive over a bridge or drink a glass of water that was designed by ChatGPT?
Certainly not a bridge, no.
Right. Not a bridge, right? So it is the very nature of generative AI and large language models is indeterministic. So it is a very sophisticated, complex form of pattern recognition. And if you ask it a question, it'll give you an answer. And if you ask it the exact same question, it will give you a different answer. It can hallucinate, right? So the example that we give is if you ask it to design an apple, it might show you a Mac or an iPhone. Generative design might use generative AI in different steps in the process, like Transcend uses it in various optimization and arrangement algorithm steps. But ultimately, it's using the same mathematical equations that an engineer would use to calculate the structural integrity of that bridge or the water chemistry required to remove a certain amount of phosphorus from a cubic meter of wastewater. The same equations and math that we know are scientifically sound are used, and then generative AI algorithms may be used to optimize certain elements of it. So that's the difference.
So, is there an element of configuration of the generative design technology then in line with, say, a company's design standards?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with the way software has evolved over the years, we can do a huge amount of that in the user interface itself. So you could have a user enter just, I don't know, 10 or 15 inputs and be able to get an entire preliminary design for a substation or a drinking water plant or a wastewater plant. Or they could enter 150 elements into the user interface and control every single aspect to their exact liking. And so it gives you a range of options from a configuration point of view that allow you to get the outcome you want and influence the outcome you want, or the software can make those decisions for you. And that's the benefits and flexibility that software technology evolution has given us.
It's pretty cool. It's exciting to finally see this type of technology available to our industry. What does this mean from a skills perspective or an organizational change perspective? Because I think you did touch on it before, but I imagine that does also play quite a prominent role in this.
It does. It plays a huge role. At the end of the day, what we do is as much about change management as it is about technology. If you take something that's going to take 8, 9, 10 months today and you break it down into 8, 9, 10 hours, the big question becomes, what do you do with all that extra time? How can you optimize the rest of this planning and execution process to speed it up, to de-risk your capital investment, to evaluate more options? So it's a big change organizationally. And one of the things that we do is, we don't really consider our customers as customers. We consider them as partners. And we are in this journey together with them. And we're working together with them to figure out within the context of their organization and their capital planning process, how can we roll this out in a way that's going to get you the most impact the fastest? And we try to apply everything we've learned from doing this over the past 5+ years to bring to bear. But at the end of the day, it's about people and how they change and being able to actually take the information that the software generates and analyze and compare options as opposed to spending your time doing the mathematical calculations or creating the drawings that the software is now doing for you.
Do you think this is what capital programs of the future looks like? Where do you think it goes from here?
So I think if you try to picture the world 10 years from now, if I am a utility or an asset owner planning any kind of capital project, whether it's an apartment building, highway or bridge or water treatment plant or substation or data center, I'm not just going to have a team start a manual design process like I do today. I'm going to log into a software platform, automatically generate multiple options. The skill set required is going to be thinking about what kind of scenarios I want to plan for based on the pace of change that we've seen over the past 5 or 10 years and what's predicted to happen for the future. Thinking about what scenarios are out there that I want to plan for is going to be the hard part. Generating the options and being able to quickly cost them and evaluate capital cost, operating costs, carbon footprint, space, feasibility, visualizing that option for other stakeholders to buy in. Those are going to become a lot easier. That's how I see the future, and that's how I certainly hope it will be for all of our sakes.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. I'm really interested to. I'd like to just almost loop back to one of the points we briefly touched on towards the start around your passion for tackling quite unsexy challenges that we're faced with.
Yeah,
I'm really interested in your approach of taking a startup mindset to quite difficult physical challenges, and specifically around the lessons that you've learned along the way from this journey. Because Transcend now is a pretty well established, funded business with a lot of revenue and customers around the world. What have been your learnings in building that business?
yeah. It's true. We are definitely tackling a very difficult and unsexy problem in many ways. When we talk about procurement processes and capital planning processes, it isn't really like satellite imagery of a site or putting sensors to measure things in real time. I do think, and this has just been a belief that was probably hardwired into me from my parents and even my grandparents, that the hard things, the difficult things in life are the ones that are worthwhile and have the biggest payoff at the end. And I've always tried to tackle complex problems. And I think that with each of our customers, and maybe this goes to the learnings, this has been the approach that we've taken, is just being transparent and honest that this is actually a really hard thing that we're talking about doing. You're not just going to change overnight. This is going to be a journey that you go through, whether it's a utility or an engineering firm or a technology supplier. they all have a status quo way that they do what Transcend is automating. And so it's ultimately the biggest learning is about people and understanding that people are going to be resistant to change. At the same time, everyone has a positive intention to try to do things better, especially people in and around these industries that are trying to build sustainable infrastructure. They're very frequently doing it because they have good reasons at heart to do that. And finding ways to be able to connect with those people and slowly progress through this change process and partnering with them along that journey, as opposed to just selling software that you log in and hit a button and go, has been probably our biggest learning over the past 5 years.
And when you're looking out for those change agents, what do they all have in common, would you say? What are the key characteristics for the individuals in these large organizations that you try and look out for?
It's a great question. We talk about that a lot internally, right? Try to find out what is this profile. It's like the maverick profile
Mm.
in many
Yeah.
ways, especially in large organizations. Um, Ultimately, it's a personality type that is willing to embrace change, that isn't afraid of conflict, because there will be conflict wherever there's change, and that ultimately is driving towards a longer term outcome and not just a shorter term goal. I think those are three elements that are critical in identifying the right person in an organization. It truly is a team sport, though, especially when you talk about the kind of change that we're implementing here, where you need to have multiple stakeholders at different levels of the organization and even partners and externals buying into this kind of shift. So,
And I guess just one of the interesting elements to your journey at Transcend, when it comes to your product specifically, is that you take a very much a product led growth approach
mhm,
rather than, say, a sales driven approach, which many other organizations take. It
mhm.
is a very tangible product with meaning, and you very much lead with that when you approach new potential opportunities. Could you talk a little bit about that decision and that culture you've instilled at Transcend?
Yeah. This was something that we really decided in the very beginning, when we tried to lay out what are the differentiators that we want to focus on as a business. Product led growth was one of them. PLG to most SaaS people means you're in an application, you try to click on something, it's grayed out, and then you have to pay more money to open it up. There's not a salesperson calling you. That's not what PLG means at Transcend. For us, product led growth means, are we investing in the technologies that asset owners and utilities in this industry or in the industries that we're in, what they're focused on, right? The technologies that are going to drive that industry forward. So the most difficult problems, going back to always trying to focus on the difficult things, right? The most difficult problems that these utilities and asset owners are trying to solve. When we entered the drinking water space earlier this year, we focused on the PFAS issue, microplastics in our drinking water, which is a hot topic. Ultimately, that's what utilities are faced with in the United States. There's a new EPA regulation, and they're all faced with finding ways to solve this problem. 2 years ago, when we entered the power sector, we chose to focus on transmission and distribution, and in particular, the utility interconnect problem. Because today, when you want to connect renewables to the grid, it takes years, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years just to connect. And design is a part of that process. And so, if we can speed up the design, we can speed up the interconnection process. So, that is a critical part of our strategy as a company. And it also goes back to the perspective that our customers are really our partners in this journey, especially with utility customers when they're doing their capital planning, like in the UK with the AMP cycles and the next 5 coming up. There's certain technologies that are a focus because we're trying to remove phosphorus from wastewater. We're trying to reduce energy consumption. We're trying to have more reliable treatment. And when those technologies are the focus, we're going to invest in the platform to make sure that they're in there so that we're helping drive the industry forward. And that's also driving growth for Transcend.
Ari, absolutely amazing to hear about your journey I'm so inspired by the company that you've built alongside the team at Transcend. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.